Sahana Vavatu, Sahano Bhunaktu, Sahavidyan Karavavahai, Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahi. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Welcome. Just checking this. Okay. Welcome to our Saturday morning Bhagavad Gita class. We began Chapter 2 in the previous class, and we'll begin our chanting, our recitation today from the beginning of Chapter 2. Be sure you glance at the meaning before you chant after me. Sanjaya Vacha, Sanjaya Vacha, Tam Tata Kripaya Vishtam, Tam Tata Kripaya Vishtam, Ashrupurna Kulekshanam, Ashrupurna Kulekshanam, Vishidantamidam Vakyam, Vishidantamidam Vakyam, Uvacha Madhusudanaha, Uvacha Madhusudanaha, Shri Bhagavanu Vacha, Shri Bhagavanu Vacha, Kutastva Kashmalamidam, Kutastva Kashmalamidam, Vishame Samupastitam, Vishame Samupastitam, Anarya Jushtamaswargyam, Anarya Jushtamaswargyam, Akirtikaram Arjuna, Akirtikaram Arjuna, Klaibyam Asmahkamah Partha, Klaibyam Asmahkamah Partha, Naitadtvayupapadyate, Naitadtvayupapadyate, Kshudram Hridaya Daurbalyam, Kshudram Hridaya Daurbalyam, Tyaktvotishtha Parantapa, Tyaktvotishtha Parantapa, Arjunuvacha, Arjunuvacha, Katham Bhishmamaham Sankhe, Katham Bhishmamaham Sankhe, Dronan cha Madhusudana, Dronan cha Madhusudana, Ishubhi Pratiyotsyami, Ishubhi Pratiyotsyami, Pujarha Varisudana, Pujarha Varisudana. Guru Nahatva hi Mahanubhavan, Guru Nahatva hi Mahanubhavan, Shreyo Bhoktam Bhaikshyamapi haloke, Shreyo Bhoktam Bhaikshyamapi haloke, Hatvartha Kamans tu Guru Nihaiva, Hatvartha Kamams tu Guru Nihaiva, Bhunjiya Bhogan Rudhira Pradigdhan, Bhunjiya Bhogan Rudhira Pradigdhan, Nachaitad Vitma Kataranno Gariyo, Nachaitad Vitma Kataranno garimo, yadvajayema yadivano jayeyu, yadvajayema yadivano jayeyu, yaneva hatva najijivishamas, yaneva hatva najijivishamas, tevastitha Pramukhe dhartarashtraha, Tevastitah Pramukhe dhartarashtraha, Karpanya doshopahatasvabhavaha, Karpanya doshopahatasvabhavaha, Pritchamit tvam dharma sammudachetaha, Pritchamit tvam dharma sammudha-chetaha yat shreyasyan nishchitam bruhi tanme yat shreyasyan nishchitam bruhi tanme shishyasteham shadhi mam tvam prapannam shishyasteham shadhi mam tvam prapannam nahi prapashyami mamapanudyat nahi prapashyami mamapanudyat yat chokamuchoshanam indriyanam yat chokamuchoshanam indriyanam avapya bhumavasapatnamruddham avapya bhumavasapatnamruddham rajyam suranamapi chadipatyam rajyam suranamadi chadipatyam sanjayo vacha sanjayo vacha evam uktva hrishikesham evam uktva hrishikesham gudakesha parantapa gudakesha parantapa na yotsya hiti govindam na yotsya hiti govindam uktva tushnim babhuvaha uktva tushnim babhuvaha tamuvacha hrishikeshaha tamuvacha hrishikeshaha prahasanniva bharata prahasanniva bharata senayorubayor madhye senayorubayor madhye vishidantamidam vachaha vishidantamidam vachaha. Very good. We'll conclude our recitation there and pick up where we left off. Yeah, we'll begin here. Last verse we saw. So we're continuing in the introduction to the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. The teachings, as you remember, begin with Chapter 2, verse 11. All of Chapter 1 and the first 10 verses of Chapter 2 are all introductory, part of the story of the Mahabharata, leading up to Sri Krishna's teachings. And that introduction, don't mistake my words, that introduction is extremely important to set the context of the Mahabharata. To set the context of the Bhagavad Gita. We've seen in great detail Arjuna's inner conflict. This is one of the several meanings of the battlefield, the battle that goes on within Arjuna, between Arjuna's intellect and his emotions, between his head and heart, so to speak. Intellectually, Arjuna knows he must fight to preserve dharma, but his intellect has been hijacked by his emotions. He's using his intellect to justify his emotional response, and his emotional response is to do that which, the term that strikes me is that which is emotionally comfortable. Following dharma is not always emotionally comfortable. For Arjuna to proceed on into that war is anything but emotionally comfortable. But Arjuna, with his intellect, Arjuna must discern and follow dharma and not abandon dharma and seek emotional comfort running away from the battlefield. One comment I received, actually a couple of comments, still some confusion about this head versus heart. Please note that I've only used the word heart to represent emotions. Other spiritual teachers use heart to represent many other things. Ramana Maharshi was famous for his use of the word heart to represent consciousness. Other teachers will use heart for your higher wisdom or something like that. Notice I've only used the word heart to represent emotions. So when I say head versus heart, it means intellect versus emotions and nothing else. Intellect is capable of determining dharma. Emotions will seek what's comfortable, and seeking what's comfortable may not be consistent with dharma. Okay. We've seen all that in great length. We saw at the end of chapter 1, Arjuna was incapacitated by this inner battle between head and heart. Beginning of chapter 2, Sri Krishna began with several verses of what in American English is called tough love. You use harsh words to motivate someone. And after that tough love, it clearly didn't work. So Arjuna continues to struggle with his emotional conflict, and that's where we will continue today. We'll continue here with verse 6. And you'll remember this longer meter is used for dramatic reasons. Na vidma, na chaitad vidma kataranno gariyo, na chaitad vidma kataranno gariyo, yad vajayema yadivano jayeyuhu, yad vajayema yadivano jayeyuhu, yaneva hatvana jijivishamas, yaneva hatvana jijivishamas, te vastita pramukhe dhartarashtraha, te vastita pramukhe dhartarashtraha. Arjuna speaks here using the royal we referring to himself. He says, etat, that chaitat is two words, cha etat, etat this, cha and, na vidmaha, we don't know, we don't understand, we can't discern, naha, the words all run together, katarat naha, naha for us, using the royal we, naha for us, meaning for me, katarat which, gariyas, which is better. Arjuna says in the first line, and I'll just put it in normal language, I don't know which is better for me. The plural is a so-called royal we. What is better? Yadva jayema, if it's better that we should conquer, that I should conquer, that I should go out onto the battlefield and eventually the Pandavas will be victorious. Yadiva, or if naha jayeyuhu, jayeyuhu, they should conquer naha, us. Again, royal we. I don't know if it's better if I should conquer them or they should conquer us. Recall, Arjuna is crucial to the Pandava army. If Arjuna were to leave the battlefield, without doubt, the Pandavas would lose the battle, the Kauravas would prevail, adharma would overcome everything. Arjuna continues, Yaneva hatva, hatva having killed, Yaneva having killed these. Having killed whom? Last line. Te, them. Who are them? Avastitaha pramukhe, those who are avastitaha, assembled. Pramukhe, right in front of us. Remember, Arjuna and Sri Krishna are in a chariot in the middle of the battlefield. And at this point, Arjuna is looking across the battlefield to the Kauravas. So the Kauravas are pramukhe. They are pramukhe avastitaha. They are assembled here, pramukhe, right in front of us. And who are they? Dhartarashtraha, the sons of Dhritarashtra. They are all standing there. Notice when Arjuna is saying, what is better? I don't know if this is better or that is better. If it is better to fight or if it's better to withdraw from war. We used the term before, dharma sankata. Sankata means conflict in general, but a particular kind of conflict where if option A is bad, option B is equally bad. There's no easy solution to the problem. Obviously, if there was an easy solution to Arjuna's problem, we wouldn't have the Bhagavad Gita. There's no easy solution. Arjuna is struggling with this, and we'll see the solution as we continue. Karpanya doshopahata svabhavaha Karpanya doshopahata svabhavaha Prachami tvam dharma sammudha chetaha Prachami tvam dharma sammudha chetaha Yat shreyasya nishchitam bruhi tanme Yat shreyasya nishchitam bruhi tanme Shishyasteham shadhimam tvam prapannam Shishyasteham shadhimam tvam prapannam. In the first half, Arjuna, by very beautiful words he uses here. Arjuna admits he is, look at the second line first. He says that he is dharma sammudha chetaha. Arjuna says that he is sammudha, that dharma, Arjuna admits that his chetas at the end of the compound, his mind is sammudha, confused about dharma. So Arjuna is saying, my mind is confused about dharma and prachami tvam, and I ask you. The first line is one long compound word that also, by which Arjuna also refers to himself. He says that he is karpanya dosha upahata swabhavaha. Arjuna says that his swabhava, his inner condition, is upahata, overcome by the dosha, by here meaning weakness, by the weakness of karpanya, pity. So Arjuna is overcome by sadness, anticipating the death of so many of his loved ones on the battlefield. And he says it very beautifully. He says, I am overcome by the weakness of pity, my translation, but more precisely, he says, I'm overcome by the sadness of anticipating the death of all my loved ones on the battlefield. And he further says, dharma sammudha chetaha. Something crucial here. Arjuna is confused. The whole first, end of the first chapter and beginning of the second chapter is all his confusion. What should I do? And a nice observation I've made several times before is there are two different kinds of confusion in life. One is to be confused and know you're confused. The other is worse. It's to be confused and either not to know you're confused or to refuse to admit you're confused. And a nice example of the latter is so often a married couple will be driving someplace in a car, and they get lost. He is driving, and they're completely lost. She says, "Why don't we pull over here and get some directions?" And very often he'll say, "I don't need to pull over. I know where I'm going. We'll get there. Don't tell me what to do." Now, this is so typical. They're both lost. She's confused as to the directions, and she admits she's confused and wants to pull over and get some directions. He's equally confused. He doesn't know where he's going, but he refuses to admit he's confused. That male pride, this kind of silliness. Anyway, obviously the second kind of confusion is worse when you're confused and either you don't know you're confused or you refuse to admit you're confused. Here, obviously, Arjuna does not fall into that second category. He admits, Dharma samudha chetaha. He says, my mind is confused as to what is Dharma. Therefore, prachami tvam, tvam unto you, Krishna. Prachami, I ask, yat shreyaha syat. Yat syat, what would be shreyas? Shreyas means best. What would be best for me? Nishchitam bruhi tanme. Nishchitam bruhi. Tell clearly, tat, that, me, unto me. Tell that clearly unto me, yat shreyaha syat, what would be best for me? What should I do? With these words, Arjuna admits he's confused. He seeks Sri Krishna's guidance, and he further says, Shishyaha te aham. Aham, I am te shishyaha. I am your student. Shadhi mam. Shadhi, teach. Mam, me. Teach me. I am your student. Teach me. Tvam. Tvam prapannam. Teach me, the one who is prapannam, having sought refuge. Tvam, from you. Having sought your refuge, having sought your advice, teach me. I admit I'm confused. Please tell me clearly what is best. I am your student. Teach me. I have resorted to you. I seek your guidance. To me, this is one of the most beautiful verses in the entire Bhagavad Gita because it shows. And interesting, it's not spoken by Sri Krishna. My favorite verse is spoken by Arjuna. But you can see why it's my favorite verse. It conveys such a strong feeling of Arjuna admitting his confusion, admitting his helplessness, and recognizing that he is completely dependent on Sri Krishna's guidance here. It shows the attitude of seeking guidance from a guru. And there are many texts that describe the importance of a student's attitude in approaching a teaching and in approaching a teacher. I remember my own case in 1981, quite a while ago, when I first met Puja Swami Dayananda, my guru. Prior to that time, I'd listened to many teachings. I was one of the typical American seekers, going from one guru to another, one tradition to another. They call it the spiritual shopping. I was doing that for a number of years. But then in 1981, I heard Puja Swamiji teach. And immediately I recognized that he had something of great value that I wanted to know. And it was very easy at that time for me to commit myself to becoming a student and to being very dedicated to those studies. I think the fact that I had done my shopping already made it possible to be doubt-free and completely committed. The point I guess I'm trying to convey is that commitment, recognizing that the teachings and teacher have something of such tremendous value, and that value creates in your mind the proper attitude. We seek what we have great value for. To the extent that you see the value of these teachings, to that extent you will be driven to seek them. That's the importance of the attitude. Okay. Arjuna has one more verse. nahi prapashyami mamapanudyat, nahi prapashyami mamapanudyat, yat chokamuchoshanam indriyanam, yat chokamuchoshanam indriyanam, avapya bhumavasapatnam riddham, avapya bhumavasapatnam riddham, Rajyam suranam api charipatyam, Rajyam suranam api charipatyam. Arjuna concludes here. He says, Nahi prapashyami, I do not see. He, indeed, I do not see. Mama, for me, apanudyat, that which could remove for me, that which could remove what? Yat shokam. The spelling changes due to grammar rules. I don't see what could remove yat shokam, that sorrow. What sorrow? Uchoshanam indriyanam. The sorrow that uchoshanam dries up. Indriyanam, my senses. My senses is a little technical expression, but that which dries up my senses, that which, what would be a more colloquial expression? That which is wearing me out, that which is dragging me down, this sorrow which is exhausting me, this sorrow which is dragging me down into deep depression. He says, Arjuna says, na prapashyami, I don't see apanudyat, anything that could remove my sadness, my sorrow. Again, we call this anticipatory grief. Arjuna knows that so many of his beloved family members will die in the battlefield. He is already grieving their loss. Sadness, anticipatory grief. And he says, I don't see a solution to my problem no matter what. And he gives two possibilities here. What might be able to solve his problem but can't. He says, avapya, even if I gain bhumau, you have to break the words apart, bhumau asapatnam riddham rajyam. Let me connect the words for you. Avapya rajyam. Even if I gain, even having gained rajyam, the kingdom. So option one is Arjuna goes forward and fights, and avapya rajyam, having gained this kingdom, bhumau, on this earth, having gained this earthly kingdom, and having gained it with riddham, all of its wealth, asapatnam riddham, unrivaled wealth. Unrivaled wealth, no greater wealth, no greater prosperity. So Arjuna says two options. One is, suppose I go ahead and fight and regain this kingdom with its unrivaled wealth. He says, even then, I don't see what could remove my sorrow. And one more possibility, he says, suranam apicha adhipatyam. Adhipatyam. He says, even gaining so one is, there's a little poetic device going on here. He's comparing bhumau, earthly happiness, to suranam, the happiness of the gods, heavenly happiness. So he says, earthly happiness won't remove my sorrow. He says, suranam api cha adhipatyam, even gaining adhipatyam, lordship, suranam, over the gods. Lordship over the gods means being king of heaven, means being Indra. Even becoming Indra happened to be his father. if you remember the story. Anyway, even gaining this supreme heavenly happiness won't remove his sorrow. So Arjuna says, gaining earthly happiness won't remove my sorrow. Even gaining the supreme heavenly happiness won't remove my sorrow, Arjuna says. This is crucial. This is a crucial, I'll call it an intellectual conversion. And here's the point. Prior to this intellectual conversion, you may think there's a solution to the problem somehow, somewhere. The problem is one of suffering, sadness. And everyone thinks that there is some problem, some solution to my problem out there. I'm struggling, I'm sad, I have so many problems, but there is a solution out there somehow, somewhere. There's no solution to the problem of sadness, right? Sadness is a normal human condition. This is we're going to see this in another verse also, but let me set it up right now. If you think spiritual life will remove sadness from your life, there's a problem with that kind of thinking. Sadness is a normal human emotion. If you can't feel sad, you're emotionally numb inside. There's something wrong if you can't feel sadness. Sadness isn't the problem. We're going to discuss this more in a few more verses. Sadness isn't the problem. Suffering is the problem. And we make a distinction between the two. Sadness is an emotion. And emotions are natural. Suffering, Sadness is a normal emotion. Suffering is how you respond to that emotion. You know what it is to be sad. Oftentimes, our response to sadness is, I don't want to feel sad. I want this sadness to go away. Why did this have to happen to me? Commonly spoken words. Why me? Those expressions, why me, that's an expression of suffering. You can be sad without suffering. You can be sad without feeling, why me? We're going to see that much more. But the point here is there's no solution to the problem of sadness, which is what Arjuna is recognizing here. Sadness is inevitable in life. So what's required is a shift of direction. Instead of looking for a solution to sadness, we just said it's a normal human emotion. With this verse, Arjuna recognizes there is no worldly solution to the problem of sadness. Just like there's no worldly solution to the problem of old age and death. There's no worldly solution. These are inevitable. Sadness, old age, and death are inevitable. There is no worldly solution. Most people spend a lot of effort trying to solve those problems. If you have sadness, find a solution to the sadness. What is the solution? Everyone has a different kind of solution. Many people turn on the television as a solution to sadness. Some people, unfortunately, will take to drink or drugs as a solution to sadness. Very unhealthy. But in one way or another, most people seek a worldly solution to the problem of sadness, And as long as you think there is a worldly solution to the problem of sadness, you're going to continue watching TV or drinking or whatever is your solution to sadness, none of which works. The point in this verse is Arjuna has recognized there is no worldly solution to the problem of sadness. This recognition can bring about an intellectual conversion where you recognize the futility of trying to find a worldly solution to the problem of sadness, and therefore you start looking for a spiritual solution. This is the intellectual conversion. Previously, looking for a worldly solution. After this intellectual conversion, looking for a spiritual solution. In Arjuna's words here, we can see that that intellectual conversion has taken place. Arjuna is now ready for Sri Krishna's spiritual teachings, and we'll see that. First, we return to the palace. Remember, this is going on the battlefield, and all of it is being narrated by Sanjaya to the blind king Dhritarashtra. Sanjaya vacha, Sanjaya vacha, evam uktva hrishikesham, evam uktva hrishikesham, gudakesha parantapa, gudakesha parantapa, na yotsya hiti govindam, na yotsya hiti govindam, uktva tushnim bhabhuvaha, uktva tushnim bhabhuvaha. Sanjaya narrates to Dhritarashtra. In fact, you see in the second line, parantapa. So here Sanjaya addresses Dhritarashtra as Parantapa, mighty one, scorcher of foes. O king, Parantapa, O king, evam uktva, having spoken thus to whom? Hrishikesham. There's in the slide. The slide is fixed. Okay. Having spoken thus to Sri Krishna. Remember these names? Hrishika, Isha, Lord of the senses, and Gudaka, Isha, next line, Lord of sleep. So all these names we have here. Sri Krishna is Hrishika, Isha, Lord of the senses. Arjuna is Gudaka, Isha, Lord of sleep, master, one who has mastered sleep. So Gudakeshaha, Arjuna, evam uktva, having spoken thus, Hrishikesham, to Sri Krishna. Notice that we went back to the shorter meter, the Anushtubh Chandas, having 8 syllables per quarter, which is by far the most common meter in the entire Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita. So what does, so Arjuna, having spoken thus to Sri Krishna, then what? In the last line, uktva, having said Govindam, to Govinda, to Sri Krishna. The commentator makes an interesting point. The common meaning of Govinda is a shepherd. Go means cow, and the root vind is to find. So Govinda is a common term for a cowherd, one who finds the cows that wander off. Our commentator makes a nice observation that go also means words, in particular the words of the Vedas. So therefore Govinda is also the one who has attained, or the one who knows the words of the Vedas, the one who is enlightened through the Vedic teachings. So 2 meanings of Govinda. But interesting little problem here. So Arjuna, having spoken thus to Sri Krishna, then what is his final word? Uktva, having said Govindam, having said to Sri Krishna, Nayotsya iti. Nayotsya, I will not fight. Nayotsya. Now, what's interesting is 2 verses back, he said, I surrender to you, tell me what to do. 2 verses back, he says, I seek your guidance. Tell me what is best. 2 verses later, he says, Nayotsya. To put words in Arjuna's mouth, "Oh Krishna, tell me what to do, but don't tell me to fight." This has happened to you. You've given, no doubt, there's been a situation where you've given advice to a friend, and your friend asks for your advice, but then rejects your advice. This starts to look a little bit like that. Of course, Arjuna is not rejecting Sri Krishna's advice, but rather he is still stuck in this emotional paralysis. He's still stuck in this dharma sankata. He is frozen by inner conflict, and that at the end of this conflict, he says, Nayotsya, I won't fight, and tushnim bhabhuvaha. Sanjaya narrates that Arjuna bhabhuva, he became tushnim, silent. Arjuna uttered these final words, I won't fight, and tushnim bhabhuva, Arjuna fell silent. Then what happened? Tamuvacha hrishikeshaha, tamuvacha hrishikeshaha, prahasanniva bharata, prahasanniva bharata, senayorubayor madhye, senayorhubayor madhye, vishidantamidam vachaha, vishidantamidam vachaha. So then what happened? Hrishikeshaha, Sri Krishna, uvacha, said to tam, him, Arjuna. What about Arjuna? Look at the last line. Arjuna who was vishidantam, Arjuna who was sunk into depression. Arjuna who was so depressed, Sri Krishna said, idam vachaha, this word, the statement that we'll see in the next verse. And when did this take place? In the third line, senayoho ubhayoho madhye, madhye, in the middle, standing between, senayoho ubhayoho, ubhaya, both, sena, armies, so standing between both armies, the chariot out there in the middle of the battlefield, while standing there in the chariot between both armies, Sri Krishna began to address Arjuna with the following words. Sri Krishna's teachings begin with the very next verse, verse 11. The most interesting part of this verse is the second line. Bharata is Sanjaya addressing the king one more time. Bharata, O king, O descendant of Bharat, O king, prahasan eva. This is Sanjaya's description of Sri Krishna. And he says Sri Krishna was prahasan eva. Eva, as though, prahasan, laughing. As though laughing means not laughing out loud, but maybe smiling or restraining a laugh. You know what it's like when you want to laugh, but it's not appropriate, so you hold the laugh in. So Sri Krishna is, as a minimum, smiling, and perhaps he's trying to restrain a laugh. Why? This is a horrible situation. A terrible war is about to break out. Arjuna has been overcome by a panic attack. He's fallen to the seat of his chariot. His bow and arrows are on. Arjuna has been crying. Arjuna is too dizzy to stand up. Arjuna is just suffering so badly. He is feeling this intense grief and sadness, anticipating the loss of his family members. And Sri Krishna is prasan eva, as though laughing. Not laughing at Arjuna. Don't make that mistake. Sri Krishna is not laughing at Arjuna, but the fact that he's smiling shows that Sri Krishna has a radically different perspective than Arjuna. Arjuna is sunk into depression, not Sri Krishna. Sri Krishna has the perspective of an enlightened person. Sri Krishna is Bhagavan, is an incarnation of God. Certainly Sri Krishna is enlightened, free from suffering. How to put it? Sri Krishna knows. Sri Krishna sees the situation from a perspective in which Sri Krishna knows it's okay. There's no problem. Now, when I say no problem, actually, I'll come to that in just a minute. There is a problem. The problem, this terrible war is about to break out. Arjuna is very sad, very depressed. Then Sri Krishna is smiling, not because there's no problem. Let me be very clear. There is a problem, a horrible problem. Yet Sri Krishna smiles because Sri Krishna is okay in spite of the problem. This goes back to our earlier discussion. I said there's no solution to sadness. Is it possible to be okay in spite of sadness? Let's explore this for just a moment. Sri Krishna is smiling here, in spite of Arjuna's sadness. How can you be okay in spite of sadness? I love to make this observation. Sadness is not your enemy. Sadness is not inherently undesirable. After all, how many sad movies have you enjoyed? You've walked out of a movie theater with tears coming down your cheeks, and you've said, "What a wonderful movie, best movie I've seen in ages." Clearly, sadness is not your enemy. Sadness is not the problem. It is possible to be okay in the presence of sadness. How? That's what the next 17 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita are all about. 2 verses back, we said that sadness is inevitable. You can't run away from sadness. You can turn on the TV, you can drink alcohol, but you can't run away from sadness. On the other hand, you can learn to be okay in the presence of sadness. Sri Krishna is in the same situation with Arjuna on the battlefield. Sri Krishna is suffering terribly because of the situation, because of his sadness. Arjuna is suffering terribly. Sri Krishna, in exactly the same situation, is not suffering, he's smiling. Why? His perspective, born of wisdom, born of knowledge, born of realization of the ultimate truth, the truth taught by the ancient rishis, the truth which is taught through all the teachings of Vedanta, including the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. With that knowledge, with that wisdom, you can gain a perspective in which you are perfectly comfortable in the presence of sadness. We call it moksha. And moksha literally means liberation is a common translation. Moksha means freedom, but freedom from what? Certainly not freedom from sadness. By the way, a common misunderstanding is moksha is only freedom from rebirth. Moksha does mean freedom from rebirth, but that comes later. You have to die, and then you can enjoy freedom from rebirth. But right now, moksha, the ultimate goal of spiritual life, as taught by the teachings of Vedanta, moksha means freedom not just when you die. Moksha means freedom now. That freedom you enjoy now is freedom from what? Based on everything we've discussed, it cannot be freedom from sadness. To feel sad is normal. I don't, do any of you, if you remember an old American television show called Star Trek? Actually, they made several movies on the Star Trek theme. If you watched any of that, do you remember a character called Spock? Spock was half human and half from another planet. And Spock had a unique trait of not feeling emotions. So when when the captain was dying, and what is Spock's response? Captain, his dear friend, the captain is Captain Kirk. You remember? Captain Kirk is dying, and Spock is watching the captain die, and Spock is emotionless. Captain, what can I do? Which is good, but emotionless. To be emotionless is to be inhuman. Spock was half inhuman. Emotions are not the problem. Sadness is not the problem. Sadness is a normal human emotion. Thank goodness, Ishvara, God gave us these emotions, otherwise we'd all be like Spock. So, moksha, liberation, freedom, cannot mean freedom from sadness. It does mean freedom from suffering. You can be sad and be content in the presence of that sadness. Like in a movie theater. In the movie theater, you even enjoy your sadness. So, the solution is not freedom from sadness. Moksha is freedom from suffering. That moksha is gained through the wisdom of the ancient rishis, and it is that wisdom that is going to be imparted by Sri Krishna to Arjuna. That the name of that wisdom, by the way, in this chapter is called Sankhya. Sankhya has several meanings, but in this chapter called Sankhya Yoga, Sankhya means spiritual wisdom. And that spiritual wisdom will be taught to Arjuna. That spiritual wisdom allows Sri Krishna to be in this horrible situation with a smile on his lips. And Sri Krishna is now going to share that same wisdom with Arjuna so that Arjuna can cope with his horrible situation, so Arjuna can become freed from his emotional paralysis. Let's see the beginning of that. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha, Shri Bhagavan Uvacha, Ashocyanan Vasocyastvam, Ashocyanan Vasocyastvam, Prajnavadamscha bhashase, Prajnavadamscha bhashase, Gata sunagata sunscha, Gata sunagata sunscha, Nanushochanti panditaha, Nanushochanti panditaha. Shri Bhagavan, the Blessed Lord, Uvacha said to Arjuna. What did he say to Arjuna? Arjuna, first line end, tvam, you. Tvam anvashochaha, good word for Sanskrit students. Second person, past tense. Arjuna, you grieve. Tvam anva, you have to break all these words apart. Tvam anu ashochaha. Tvam, you grieve after ashocyan, those who don't deserve your grief. Sounds very peculiar. You grieve after those who don't deserve your grief. Arjuna is looking across the battlefield to Bhishma and Drona and so many others that he loves dearly, And yet, Sri Krishna says, you're grieving for those who don't deserve grief. How can Sri Krishna possibly say that? Remember the sad movies you loved so much? You cried because characters died. So when that character dies in the movie, you feel sad and you enjoy that sadness. You're okay in spite of that sadness. This is Sri Krishna's perspective. Sri Krishna also knows that Bhishma and Drona and so many others will die on a battlefield, but Sri Krishna has this perspective where he knows that the sadness that results from the loss of loved ones, that sadness is not a source of suffering. Please distinguish these two. Sadness and suffering couldn't be more different. Sadness is movie theater. Suffering is why me. You can feel sad without that suffering. Why me? Why did this have to happen to me? So based on that perspective, born of wisdom, based on that perspective, Sri Krishna says to Arjuna, Tvam anu ashochaha. Arjuna, you are grieving after those ashochaha who need not be grieved for. Sri Krishna is talking about suffering, not sadness. So Sri Krishna says to Arjuna, I'll paraphrase, Arjuna, you are suffering unnecessarily. It's okay to feel sad, but you are suffering unnecessarily. On the other hand, in the second line, he says, Prajnavadan cha, and bhashase, and you speak, Prajnavadan. You speak vada, words of prajna, wisdom. You're speaking words of wisdom. Arjuna was considering, in the end of chapter 1, he was considering all the terrible consequences of the war. He was going through the damage to the family, to the kula, that would happen as a result of the war. Arjuna was speaking with great alertness, a great awareness of the tragedy of war, of the consequences of war. Arjuna was speaking with great wisdom about the consequences of war, and Sri Krishna admits that you are speaking with great wisdom, but not enough wisdom. Arjuna is wise enough to understand the consequences of war, but Arjuna doesn't have the particular wisdom that Sri Krishna has. So Sri Krishna has this wisdom that allows him to be emotionally comfortable in this horrible situation. And Sri Krishna describes that. He says here, the truly wise, in the last line, panditaha, those who are not just pandita means scholarly, but here it's referring to enlightened people. Panditaha, not scholarly people, wise people, enlightened people. Panditaha, the truly wise, the enlightened people. Na anushochanti, they do not grieve, they do not suffer. Notice I'm not sadness. Do wise people feel sad? Yes. Do wise people suffer? No. Enlightened people feel sadness, otherwise they'll be like Spock. Enlightened people do not suffer. So here, panditaha, the wise people, na anushochanti, they do not suffer, because of whom? Gatasun, agatasun cha. Gata asu. Asu means breath. Gata asu is one from whom breath has gone away, dead. Agata asu, those from whom breath has not yet gone away. It'll eventually go, but not yet. So gatasun, for those who are dead, agatasun cha, and for those who are not yet dead, panditaha, the truly wise, enlightened, na anushochanti. They do not grieve, they do not mourn, they do not suffer. Considering what's happening to those loved ones who have died and those loved ones who will die. So with this verse, Sri Krishna begins 17 more chapters of spiritual teaching. Not more chapters, but the spiritual teachings begin with this verse. And through the course of the next 17 chapters, Sri Krishna will impart this spiritual wisdom to Arjuna that will enable him to be emotionally comfortable in this horrible situation. And we'll see that in the coming classes. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhaveta Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Mahamratangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.